Imagine yourself walking through abandoned hallways and forgotten buildings, where every shadow hides a sinister secret. You will find yourself in the same places where others have faced their worst nightmares, dealing with the horrors that can reveal themselves around every corner. It is an experience that can touch on anyone's deepest pain, the fear of the unknown and of what is beyond our understanding. Night had fallen silently over the city, shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow up all sounds and lights. There was something unsettling in the air, a feeling that made our hearts beat faster and our minds wonder what was hidden in the darkness. My friends and I had heard rumors about an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, a place that, according to the stories, hid dark and inexplicable secrets. The building was in ruins, with broken windows and walls covered in dark graffiti. It was a perfect setting for an urban exploration that, although exciting, was also filled with an almost palpable dread. We entered through the main door, creaking and groaning as if the factory itself were revolting against our presence. The darkness was so dense that it seemed to have a life of its own, sliding along the walls and creating shapes that danced around us. The sound of our footsteps echoed eerily, mixed with the sound of splashing water and the whisper of the wind. As we walked deeper into the factory, the air seemed to grow thicker and thicker, filled with a musty, decaying smell. The shadows stretched and twisted, casting distorted images that made our hearts race. Suddenly, we heard a strange sound, a sharp creak, followed by a dull thud of something falling to the ground. We stopped in our tracks, our breath catching in our throats. It was just the wind. One of my friends tried to reassure himself, but his voice was shaking. We decided to investigate, shining our flashlights as we went. As we approached the sound, we found an area covered in a thick layer of dust. In the midst of this dust, there was an old iron toy, an abandoned doll that seemed to watch us with empty eyes. Fear gripped us. Something wasn't right here. The feeling that we were being watched was almost unbearable. We tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, but the shadows seemed to stir and whispers began to fill the silence. Every corner held a new threat, and the feeling of being followed intensified. As we explored a larger room, we found an old work table covered in rusty papers and equipment. Among these papers was an old notebook, with notes that seemed to tell stories of strange experiments and mysterious experiences. The last entry was especially disturbing, describing unexplained events and a menacing presence that had been recorded by those who had been there before us. Our fear turned to panic when we heard a low, distorted laugh coming from a dark corner of the room. With our hearts racing and sweat dripping down our foreheads, we ran out of the factory, the feeling of being followed intensifying with each step. When we finally stepped out into the streetlight, our bodies were tense and our thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Looking back, the factory seemed even more menacing, as if it were watching us with silent malice. We never fully understood what we had experienced that night, but one thing was certain. The abandoned factory held more than just dust and decay. It held shadows that fed on our fears and secrets that should never be revealed. The city was asleep when we returned to the factory, but we could not forget what we had seen. Each night, the thought of that damned factory haunted us. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, and the nighttime sounds became unbearable. Whatever had lurked there had become a part of our lives, tormenting us to the edge of our sanity. Determined to find out what was really going on, we decided to go back. The factory was darker than ever, and the air seemed to be filled with an oppressive pressure. The wind howled with an almost human tone, and the atmosphere was filled with a bone-piercing chill. Armed with flashlights and cameras, we entered again, each step echoing like a sign of our impending doom. Moving cautiously, we made our way directly to the room where we had found the notebook. The feeling of dread was palpable, as if something invisible was watching us. The light from our flashlights flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating distorted figures that seemed to move independently. As we reached the work table, something changed. The temperature dropped abruptly, and the air was so heavy it felt like it was breathing through us. The table felt different, almost as if it were transforming. The papers were now scattered chaotically, as if someone had tried to hide something. The feeling of being watched was intense, and every little noise made our hearts race. Then, the notebook we had seen was now in a different position, open to a page we had not seen before. The words on the page were written in desperate, almost illegible handwriting, describing an entity that fed on fear and manifested itself through the shadows. The account spoke of horrific experiences and of people who had disappeared without a trace, their souls seemingly consumed by the factory. The environment seemed to close in around us, and the feeling of being followed intensified. The light from the flashlights began to flicker, and the whispers that had previously been low and distant were now clear and menacing. "Leave, no one must know." The words mingled with the sound of the wind, as if they were being whispered directly into our ears. Suddenly, a grotesque shadow appeared on the wall, a distorted figure with glowing eyes and an oppressive presence that seemed to materialize from fear itself. Panic seized us, and we began to run, trying to escape the invisible claws that seemed to be pulling us back. The sensation of a pair of invisible hands squeezing our shoulders was almost unbearable, and the terror was so intense that it seemed as if we might faint at any moment. Running through the dark passages of the factory, we began to notice that the building seemed to be changing, the walls closing in and the corridors becoming endless mazes. The feeling of disorientation was overwhelming. Every corner we turned seemed to lead us into a new nightmare, and the fear of not being able to escape was almost paralyzing. Finally, we managed to find the exit, but when we looked back, the factory seemed even more menacing. The shadows twisted and stretched, as if celebrating our escape. In the streetlights, the factory looked as harmless as any other abandoned building, but we knew the truth. The factory held a dark and terrifying secret, a place where fear and evil intertwined in a macabre dance. We never returned. The terror of that night left deep scars on our souls, and the shadows of the factory continued to haunt us. Every noise in the night, every shadow in the corner of our eyes, reminded us of those hellish hours. The abandoned factory became a constant reminder that there are places where fear becomes reality, and where some secrets are best left buried. The abandoned hospital on the outskirts of the city has always been a mystery shrouded in urban legends and rumors of supernatural happenings. The decaying structure, with broken windows and rusted doors, was an invitation to the brave or foolhardy, seeking an extra dose of adrenaline. But what no one knew was that this place held secrets so disturbing that they would challenge even the most fearless explorer. I, like many others, had heard about the echoes that seemed to resonate in the hospital walls, murmurs of a dark past that refused to die. I decided I had to see for myself. Curiosity and the desire to face my fears led me to a night I would never forget. The entrance to the hospital seemed more ominous as the night wore on. The piercing cold and growing darkness only accentuated the weight of the decision I was about to make. With a flashlight in hand and a camera around my neck, I entered the main hallway. The air was heavy with a musty odor of decay. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. Each room I explored seemed to have its own story. In one room, I found an old hospital bed, covered in a thick layer of dust, with seatbelts still attached, as if someone had left in a hurry. In another, torn papers and old photographs were scattered across the floor, silent witnesses to a time that had been cruelly cut short. It was then that the first echoes began to appear. A high-pitched scream, devoid of any context, seemed to cut through the silence. I froze, trying to rationalize the sound, but fear grew like a cancer, spreading through my body. The feeling of being watched was palpable, and with every step I took, the echo of the scream seemed to grow closer. I followed the sound to an old surgical suite. The doors were ajar, and a cold draft seemed to blow from within. The flashlight illuminated what was left of the room. Rusty operating tables and medical equipment covered in a layer of dust. But what really stopped me was the sound that began to manifest itself more clearly. It wasn't just screams, but a chorus of desperate voices that seemed to be crying out for help, crossing time and space. I was about to turn the doorknob when a shadow quickly projected itself over the wall. My heart raced, and a wave of dread washed over me. I looked back and saw an indistinct figure, a silhouette that seemed to float in the air. The feeling of being so vulnerable and exposed was overwhelming. Desperate to escape the place, I began to run through the corridors. Each step seemed heavier than the last, and the echo of the voices seemed to intensify. Finally, I reached the exit, but the feeling that something was still following me lingered. The cursed hospital had left its mark, an eerie reminder that some mysteries are best left untouched. I left the cursed hospital that night, but the experience never left me. Fear, like a persistent shadow, hung over me, and the images of that place became a recurring nightmare. Since then, the echo of the screams has never left my ears. They became a constant reminder that the hospital had something deeper and more disturbing than I could understand. A month after my visit, I decided to revisit the place. Curiosity was now mixed with an obsessive desire to understand what had really happened. When I returned, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The air seemed thick, and the room was enveloped in an ominous silence, broken only by the occasional sound of my own footsteps. The moment I entered, the room seemed different, darker, more charged. The walls were damp and covered in black moss, as if the place was absorbing negative emotions. The flashlight cast grotesque shadows on the walls, and the echoes of the screams seemed to intensify with each step I took. I arrived back at the operating room. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. The room was filled with a cold, heavy energy. The sound of the screams I had heard that first night returned, but now they were much more intense, almost as if someone were screaming directly into my ears. The screams were a mix of despair and agony, cutting through the silence with a disturbing clarity. Suddenly, a cold sensation ran down my spine. The voices seemed to be concentrated in a single direction. I looked at the operating table in front of me, and what I saw made me freeze. The shadows in the room began to contort and form grotesque shapes. The figures seemed to move, pulsing with a malevolent energy. It was as if the spirits of former patients were manifesting, their souls tormented in an endless cycle of suffering. Fear took hold of me. I tried to run, but the screams were deafening, echoing in my ears and causing my mind to become lost in confusion. The feeling of panic intensified, and the shadows seemed to close in on me. Every step I took seemed to take me deeper into an endless nightmare. Finally, I managed to find the exit. My heart was beating wildly, and my body was covered in cold sweat. When I finally breathed in the cool night air, I felt a momentary relief, but the terror was still with me. The feeling that something was lurking, waiting to drag me back to the hospital, never left. The city lights flickered in the distance, their almost comfortable appearance contrasting with what I was about to face. My footsteps echoed through the abandoned tunnel, a maze of dark, damp corridors, where the air was heavy and the tension palpable. I never imagined that curiosity could lead someone to such an oppressive and distressing place. It was a cold, rainy night when I decided to explore the ancient system of underground tunnels that wound beneath the city. The reputation of these tunnels was sinister. Rumors of disappearances and encounters with the unexplained were common among locals, but none of that prepared me for what was to come. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I descended through the rusty entrance, unaware that I was about to enter a nightmare that would challenge my sanity. Soon, the narrow, mold-covered corridors began to intertwine, forming a veritable maze. Each step seemed to reverberate in a symphony of distorted echoes, as if something or someone was following close behind, always out of sight but never out of mind. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the constant humidity made the environment seem even more repulsive and suffocating. Then I found a rusty door, barely visible against the wall covered in graffiti and dirt. Curiosity forced me to open it, revealing a small, almost cell-like space with a single chair in the center. My heart raced as I saw a series of strange marks on the floor, as if something had been dragged or pulled out. Unable to control the impulse, I approached the chair, noticing that it was covered in a fabric that seemed recent. The chill in my spine was indescribable, and every muscle in my body was on high alert. Then, the absolute silence was broken by a low, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too clear, a voice muttering incomprehensible words. My instinct was to pull away, but something compelled me to stay, to seek the source of that disturbing sound. The whisper grew louder, turning into a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from deep within the tunnel itself. My blood ran cold as I realized I was not alone. The atmosphere around me became charged with an oppressive energy, and I could sense the presence of something evil, something that did not belong in this world. Every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, and the feeling of being surrounded intensified. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. In the pitch black, the sound of the whispers became a deafening scream, and I ran, racing through the twisting corridors in a frenzy of panic. Finally, I managed to find the exit, but the experience scarred me forever. Sometimes at night, when the wind howls and the silence is profound, I can still hear those whispers, as if they had never truly ended. The urban labyrinth revealed itself to be not just a physical labyrinth, but a labyrinth of fear and anguish, where the true face of horror is what we cannot see, but feel intensely. The air was thick with the smell of mold and despair when I finally emerged from the underground labyrinth. The city light seemed almost surreal, an almost magical relief after the terror I had experienced. But as I discovered, the true essence of fear is not erased by the light of day. Over the next few days, things began to happen. At first, they were just small details. Doors that closed by themselves, whispers I could swear I heard when I was alone. Then things got worse. At night, in my apartment, the atmosphere became unbearable. I felt as if the tunnel itself was trying to infiltrate my life, carrying with it the echoes of its malignancy. It was as if something had followed me, something I could not see but could clearly feel. The shadows in my house seemed to stretch and move with a life of their own. The wailing I had heard in the tunnel turned into desperate screams in my dreams, and I would wake with my heart racing, the sensation of icy hands squeezing my neck. Every corner seemed to hide an invisible threat, and the solitude of the labyrinth now seemed like a constant presence in my life. I knew I couldn't stay like this. I decided to investigate further and look for answers about what really was in the tunnel. What I discovered was even more disturbing. Ancient urban legends spoke of occult rituals and beings that fed on fear. Many who entered the tunnels were never seen again, and those who returned were altered, consumed by the presence they found there. The feeling of being watched was not just paranoia, but a cruel and sinister reality. In the end, the urban labyrinth revealed itself to be not just a physical place of horror, but a gateway to an experience that transcends human comprehension. The fear I felt there never completely left me, and the feeling of being pursued by something beyond this world is a reality I have to deal with every day. So I ask myself, would you have the courage to face what I faced? What is hidden in the shadows of forgotten and abandoned places? If you were touched by this story, if the terror I experienced stirred your emotions, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our next videos. Leave a like if you also feel that curiosity and fear go hand in hand, and share your opinion in the comments. The urban labyrinth is just the beginning, and there is much more to explore in this universe of terror and mystery.